We're on the top of DAF Yud Ches on the second line. We saw a machlokas yesterday between Rav Huna in the name of Rav. I just want you to just remember the names here. Rav Huna in the name of Rav on one side, and Rav Yehuda on the other side. You'll see why momentarily why these names are significant. But Rav Huna in the name of Rav says that in the event that a Yevama has not had Yibum yet, and she dies in the interim before the Yavam can do Yibum with her, then it is permitted for the former Yavam to marry the mother of the deceased Yevama. And the Gemara had said what that essentially boils down to is the principle of Ein Zika. He holds that Zika does not create that pseudo-marriage to the point where we would consider this woman to be his wife, to aser, to prohibit her relatives, because they never got married. Okay, Rav Yehuda disagrees, and Rav Yehuda says, no, yesh zika. Even though they never performed yibum, the very fact that there was a zika bond between them, even though this woman is dead, her mother is permanently prohibited to the yavam.
But so zika hasn't got such a strength like the real thing.
It doesn't have the same strength, and that's why there's a machlokas here as to how much strength it does have. That's exactly right. So the Gemara now says, Leima misayele. Let us say that the following is a support to Rav Yehuda, who says yesh zika, and therefore the mother is prohibited. And it's the same brisa that we quoted yesterday, but we're going to use it in the other direction. Yevimto shemesa muter ba'achos, I think is a Mishnah, that if the Yevama dies, you're allowed to marry her sister. Now, it seems like the Gemara's diuk is, ba'achosa in be'ima lo. Only her sister can you marry, but not her mother. And the reason being is because we know that a sister after a wife's death is permitted, but a mother after a wife's death is not permitted. So it seems like there is zika, and that's why the mother is prohibited. This is a support to Rav Yehuda. The Gemara says no. Hu hadin da'afilu bi'ima. Va'aydi d'tana reisha ishto shemesa muter ba'achosa, davka ba'achosa aval bi'ima lo, dahavi le'isur de'oraisa, tana nami seifa muter ba'achosa. So the Gemara says no. It's really altogether possible that it's permitted to marry her mother as well. But for consistency's sake, since the first part of that Mishnah was talking about your actual wife, and when your actual wife dies, you're only allowed to marry her sister, but you're not allowed to marry her mother. Therefore, for consistency, when the Sefer talked about a Yevama, it also talked about a sister, but it's not necessarily to the exclusion of the mother. It could be inclusive of the mother as well. So you have no raya from there. Masiv Rav Huna bar Chia. Asa b'maimer umeis, shnia choletzes v'lo misyabemes. Now this is our Mishnah. This is our Mishnah that we saw yesterday. We were talking about Eishes ach shelo haya ba'olamo. So remember that case. Reuven dies, he leaves over a widow. Shimon what did we say? Shimon goes ahead and does a maimer. That was the last part of our Mishnah. Instead of doing full-blown yibum, he gives her rabbinic marriage, which is what we call the maimer. And therefore she's rabbinically married to Shimon. And Shimon has another wife, a full-fledged wife. Shimon then dies, and both women fall to Levi. But Levi was only born after the fact. Levi was only born after Reuven had died. So the first wife does not fall for Yibum at all. The Yevama that Shimon did a rabbinic marriage to, but the real wife that he had has to get chalitza, because since he was only married rabbinically to the Yevama, you can't really say that Shimon's real wife is a tzara of an erva, because it's only rabbinically a tzara of an erva. Therefore, she has to get chalitza from Levi. So taima da'avad b'maimer, halo avad b'maimer shniya nami yevumi b'yabima. So the Gemara says, let's make an inference from this. The only reason why Levi cannot do yibum with Shimon's real wife is because Shimon did a maimer to Reuven's widow. But it sounds like if Reuven had not done anything at all, if he had not presented Reuven's widow with a maimer, then Levi would be able to do full-blown yibum. Levi would be allowed to do yibum, complete yibum with Shimon's wife. So v'iyomar tiyesh zika havilat saras ishas achiv shelo haya ba'olamo bezika. And if you're going to suggest to me that there is such a concept of Zika, then the very fact that Reuven died and his widow falls to Yibum, to Shimon, means that there's a Zika between them. If Zika is like a pseudo-marriage, then even if Shimon never presented the widow with a mimer, just the fact that there's Zika should make Shimon's other wife sort of like the tzara of an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo. And therefore it should be prohibited for Levi to do Yibum even if Shimon did not present a mimer. So this is the question on Rav Yehuda. If you, Rav Yehuda, hold that Zika creates a stigma of marriage such that all of the women connected to this woman are considered to be an erva, are considered to be usher, then why don't we say that Shimon's real wife, even before Shimon does anything, should be considered to be the tzara of an erva through Zika? That's the Gemara's question on Rav Yehuda. Amar Rabba, so Rabba answers and he says no. Hu hadin da'afal gav v'lo abed b'maimer, shniya mechletz chaltza yevume lo miyabema. I agree with you. Really, according to our Mishnah, even if Shimon did not present Reuven's widow with a mimer, it would be prohibited to have Yibum with Shimon's other wife for Levi, because she really is the tzara of a ne'eshes ach shelo haya ba'olamo through Zika. V'hadikatani maimer la'afuke mi beishamai da'amri maimer kona kinyan gomer kamash malan. So why then did the Mishnah talk about specifically a case where Shimon presented her with a mimer? It's telling me a chiddush in the other direction. In other words, there's a position of Beis Shammai which we have yet to study. And that is, according to Beis Shammai, a mimer is not just a rabbinic marriage for Yibum, it is a full-blown biblical marriage for Yibum. We don't paskin like Beis Shammai. We paskin that if a Yavam presents Kesef Kiddushin to a Yevama, it's only a rabbinic marriage. And therefore you have to be machmir that she's not married and that she is married. Right? However, according to Beis Shammai, she is a full-blown wife now, just by virtue of the fact that he gave her Kesef Kiddushin. According to Beis Shammai, once Shimon gives a mimer to Reuven's widow, if Shimon then dies, his other wife also does not fall to Yibum because she's mamish tzara serva. And if that's the case, there's neither Yibum or chalitza. Comes along the Mishnah to tell us, no, don't think that you don't have to, Levi doesn't have to give chalitza to that tzara. He absolutely has to give chalitza. Can't do Yibum because she's the tzara of an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo rabbinically, but not biblically, and therefore he has to give the tzara chalitza.
Talking about in the opinion of Beis Shammai or across the...
No, not according to Beis Shammai. Specifically not according to Beis Shammai. That's what we're saying.
Right.
According to Beis Shammai, she gets off scot-free. There's no zik at all. She doesn't fall for Yibum. According to Beis Hillel, she does fall for Yibum biblically, but not rabbinically, and therefore he's got to give her chalitza. Eisvei Abaye. So Abaye now challenges this with the next. I think this is also we'll see this on DAF Yotes. It's a Mishnah. Shnei achim ba'olam echad. You have two brothers who are alive at the same time, Reuven and Shimon. Umeis echad mehen below Vlad. Reuven dies without children. Va'amad hasheni hazel lasos maimer biyavimto. Shimon says, okay, I'm going to give her a mimer. V'lo hispik lasos ba'maimer ad shenolad lo ach. And before he had a chance to even do the mimer, Levi is born. Okay, so Levi is born after Reuven dies, but before Shimon does anything to this Yevama. Umeis. And then Shimon dies before having done anything. Okay? So Harishona Yotza Mishum Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya Be'olama. So Reuven's widow, of course, doesn't fall for Yibum. There's no Yibum between her and Levi because Levi, she's an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Be'olama. Ushniya O Choletzes O Misyabemes. And Shimon's full-blown wife, Shimon's wife, who now falls for Yibum to Levi, Levi can either do Yibum or Chalitza, because after all, Levi was alive when Shimon was alive. So the Iyomar Tiyesh Zika Havilatzaras Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olama Bezika. And according now the problem is that there was a Zika between Reuven's widow and Shimon. If there was a Zika between Reuven's widow and Shimon, and Zika is like a pseudo marriage, so then when Shimon dies, his other wife or his real wife is like the tzara of a pseudo Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olama, because it's a pseudo marriage. So if you hold that yesh zika, that zika is enough to create that pseudo marriage, so then why don't you say that Levi cannot do yibum with Shimon's wife? He can only do chalitza. So Hamani Reb Meir. So the Gemara says that Bryce on DAF Yotes that we'll see tomorrow goes according to Reb Meir. It's a different Tana, right? In other words, there's a machlokas tanoim as to whether yesh zika or ein zika. That Bryce holds ein zika, because it's Reb Meir. Da Amar ein zika. So now the Gemara asks, now wait a minute. Umi svirle the Reb Meir ein zika. Since when does Reb Meir hold that there's no zika? V'hatanan. Look at the following Mishnah. And we assume that if there's an anonymous Mishnah, then it goes according to Rabbi Meir. Look at the following Mishnah. Arba achim shnayim mehem nesuin shtei achayos umesu hanesuin ha'achayos. So the Mishnah says in the following case, you have 4 brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Reuven and Shimon are married to 2 sisters. We saw this case before. Reuven and Shimon both die in rapid succession or simultaneously. So Harei Elu Cholzos V'lo Misyabamos. So you have 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah, that were married to 2 brothers, Reuven and Shimon. They both fall for Yibum to Levi and Yehuda. So the Mishnah says that Levi and Yehuda, neither of them can do Yibum, they can only do Chalitza. Now, why is that? Ostensibly, the reason would be is because each one is an Achos Zekukaso, is the sister of the one that has Zika to the... In other words, Rachel is the sister of Leah who has Zika with each of the brothers, and Leah is the sister of Rachel who has Zika with each of the brothers. That indicates that Reb Meir holds Yesh Zika. The Ital Gedalia Silver Reb Meir ein Zika. Hani mitrei bati ka'asyan haili abim chada v'haili abim chada. If you're telling me that Reb Meir is, we assume he agrees with this Mishnah, and if you're telling me that he holds that ein Zika, then what's the problem? Let each Levi and Yehuda do separate yibums. Let Levi do yibum with one, and Yehuda will do yibum with the other sister. The only problem of Achos Zekukaso is if you hold Yesh Zika. You're telling me now Reb Meir holds ein Zika. So the Gemara answers like this: La'olam ein zika. In reality, this Mishnah also holds ein zika. So then what's the problem of doing yibum? Mishum de kasaver asur levatel mitzvahs yevamim de dilma admeyabim chad mayis idach bekabatlas mitzvahs yevamim. So the Gemara tells us a very interesting principle, and that is that really it's only a rabbinic law that you can't do actual yibum in the case of the 4 brothers. Why can't Levi and Yehuda do yibum? Because we're worried that what's going to happen. Let's go. Levi will go ahead and do yibum with Rachel. Okay, Levi will go ahead and do yibum with Rachel, whose sister is Leah. Yehuda, in anticipation that Yehuda will do yibum or chalitza to the other sister. But what happens is that after Levi has done Yibum, Yehuda dies before he has a chance to do Yibum. So what happens now? The other sister Levi is the only surviving brother. And in that situation, by virtue of the fact that Levi has already married her sister through Yibum, there's no more Zika, there's no more Yibum possible. So what Levi has essentially done is he's nullified the opportunity to do anything with that other sister. So the rabbis therefore ordained that Levi cannot do Yibum, because in the event that Yehuda would die before Yehuda follows suit, then you've been mevatel anything to be done with the other sister. And you're not allowed to do that. So therefore the rabbi said, Levi cannot do Yibum, but according to that argument, if Levi does Yibum, if Levi does Chalitza rather, then it should be permitted now for Yehuda to do Yibum. In Achinami. However, Rashi says the rabbis added to that decree. They said, no, we're not going to let Levi do Yibum, so he's got to do Chalitza, and we're also not going to let Yehuda do Yibum afterwards, because if we let Yehuda do Yibum, then people will get confused, and they said, well, if Levi did Chalitza and Yehuda did Yibum, then the next time we'll let Levi do Yibum and Yehuda do Chalitza. So therefore they made a rule across the board that any time 2 sisters fall to Yibum to 2 brothers, both of them have to give Chalitza. Not because of the problem of Achos Zekukaso, but rather we're worried that maybe after the first brother does Yibum, the second brother will die and they won't be able to do anything with that remaining sister.
Why can't they do it before, like simultaneously? As one does one, the other does the other.
Because nothing can happen simultaneously. The Gemara is going to talk about the idea of efshel etzamtzem or efshel etzamtzem. You can't do a double ring ceremony, right? It's going to have to take place in succession, one after the other, and so we're going to worry.
Even the same person who did chalitza, he can now. Why can't he himself do yibum on the other sister?
He could, but maybe he'll die. After he does. Yeah, but
that would be okay because he already did chalitza with the first one anyway.
But she's coming from a different household. These are not two women married to the same man. They're two sisters, but they're married to two brothers. Each brother, there's a mitzvah to build each brother's house. So just because he does chalitza with one sister doesn't let him off the hook from the other sister. The other sister has a house for the other brother that has to be built.
So what's the problem with that second sister who might be left hanging? Are we concerned for her future?
We're not concerned for her future. We're concerned for the mitzvah of Yibum, which we've essentially caused to be null and void. And you're not supposed to render a mitzvah null and void. That's the Gemara's concern.
Rabbi, maybe it's another question. The brother does Yibum. Is he becoming the permanent husband?
Yes, Yibum is complete marriage. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, 100%. Not. It was a very good question. It's not an Arsha question at all.
I thought they just do Yibum, so establish another.
Yeah. No. Okay. So the Gemara says, but I don't understand what your concern is. V'i ein zika tibotel. If you hold that there's no zika, then what's the big deal? So let Levi go ahead and do Yibum. And so what if Yehuda dies? So what's your concern? You'll render the mitzvah with the other woman null and void, but there's no zika. And if you hold there's no zika, you shouldn't be concerned about nullifying the mitzvah of Yibum. And I'll prove it to you. Rabbi Gamliel Amar Ein Zika Umut Levatel Mitzvahs Yevamim, because Rabbi Gamliel holds Ein Zika, and he has absolutely no concern with nullifying the mitzvah of Yibum. And how do I know this? We're going to see a Mishnah later on in the following case. The following case is Ruvain and Shimon are married to two sisters. But Ruvain's married to the older sister, Shimon's married to the younger sister. She's so young, she's not even bat mitzvah yet. And they don't have a father, so therefore it's only a rabbinic marriage between Shimon and his minor wife. Ruvain dies, and Ruvain's widow falls to Shimon for Yibum. The problem is that Shimon is married to the Yevamos sister. However, it's only a rabbinic marriage, so therefore the Chachamim Paskin, we tell the minor wife, do miyun, opt out of the marriage so that Shimon can do Yibum with your sister, which is a biblical requirement. So the Rabbi Gamliel disagrees with this, and Rabbi Gamliel says, no, imiyana miyana, if she opts on her own to do miyun, gesunter aheit, vimlo miyana, and if she chooses not to do miyun, that's also her prerogative, and tamtin ad shetagdil, v'teitze halazu mishum achos isha. Then just wait until Shimon's wife becomes bas mitzvah. He'll consummate the marriage, making it into a biblical marriage because she's now an adult. And then Ruvain's widow will not fall to him for Yibum any longer because it's achos ishto, because it's the sister of his wife. Now clearly Rabbi Gamliel must hold that there's no zika, because how could he allow Shimon to continue living with this girl if it's achos zikukaso? But he says, no, it's fine. So he holds that there's no zika, and he also holds that you have every right, if you want to nullify the opportunity to do the mitzvah of Yibum by consummating the marriage with your minor wife when she becomes an adult. So you see that once you hold Ein Zika, there's no problem with nullifying the mitzvah of Yibum. So Amar Lei de Rabbi Gamliel de Rabbi Meir Karamis. So the response back is, I don't understand what you're asking. You're showing me an example where someone who holds Ein Zika holds that it's also permitted to nullify the mitzvah of Yibum. But it's a different Tana. That's Rabbi Gamliel. Who's to say that Rabbi Meir agrees with that? Maybe Rabbi Meir would agree that even though Ein Zika, it's still not permitted to nullify the mitzvah of Yibum. And that's why, in the case of the four brothers, he holds that both have to do chalitza. The Gemara says, Lo hachi ka'amina. What I mean to say is as follows: Rabbi Meir chayish afilu l'sfeik and Rabbi Gamliel afilu levade lo chayish. My cognitive dissonance lies in the following. How can it be that both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Gamliel hold Ein Zika, and at the same time Rabbi Meir is concerned so far about nullifying the mitzvah of Yibum that even he's fearful about the remote possibility that Yehuda will die before he has a chance to do Yibum with the other sister, and therefore we tell Levi, don't do Yibum because maybe Yehuda will die and then you'll nullify the mitzvah of Yibum. So look how far Rabbi Meir is machmir to worry about being mevatel the mitzvah of Yibum, and on the other extreme you have Rabbi Gamliel, who also holds Ein Zika, and he says not even when you know for sure you're going to be nullifying the mitzvah of Yibum, we don't care. You have every right to go ahead and do whatever you please, and even if by consummating the marriage with your minor, now adult wife, you're nullifying the mitzvah of Zika, gegezun to hate. So that's what I have a problem with, is what the Makshin is asking. So the answer is no. Dilma man de lo chayesh, afilu levade lo chayesh, man de chayesh, afilu lesveika chayesh. Sorry, that's also not a problem. Because if you're chayshesh for being mevatel the mitzvah of Yibum, so then even when there's even a remote possibility, you're chayshesh, like Reb Meir is. And if you're not worried about being mevatel the mitzvah of Yibum, then even if it's a vadai that you will be mevatel it, do whatever you want. So therefore the Gemara says, that challenge that you presented from Rabbi Gamliel is not really a legitimate challenge. But let's go on. Remember I told you we have this machlokus between Rav Huna in the name of Rav and Rav Yehuda. Rav Huna in the name of Rav said Ein Zika, and therefore after the Yevama dies you're allowed to marry her mother. And Rav Yehuda says Yesh Zika, so even after the Yevama dies, assuming you haven't done Yibum, you're allowed to marry her mother. Lema, so Abaya suggests to Rav Yosef, Hada Rav Yehuda d'Shmuelhi, that Rav Yehuda, we know, was a student of both Rav and Shmuel. But it seems to be pretty clear that when he's paskening this halacha of Yesh Zika, he's going according to Shmuel. Ditnan. And how can I prove this to you? Because the Mishnah says, Shomeres Yavam Shekidesh Achiv es Achosa. We saw this case already also before. Ruvain dies and he leaves over a widow. And instead, there are multiple brothers, the Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, etc. Shimon says, you know what? I'm in love with the Yevama's sister, so I'm going to give her kesef kiddushin. Gives her a ring, and the problem is, but wait a minute, what are you going to do with the sister? So Shimon says, I don't care. Let my brother Levi go ahead and do Yibum. I'm in love with the sister. So what do we say? Mishum Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Amru Omrim lo hamtein ad sheyaseh achicha ma'isa. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, wait a minute, there is a Zika here. This woman that you presented Kedushin to is the sister of the woman that there's Zika to you. So you can't consummate that marriage. She's almost like a pseudo-marriage through that Zika. And therefore you can't be intimate with her sister. Wait until one of your brothers does Yibum and the Zika will be gone. And then you can go ahead and complete the marriage to the girl that you love, the sister. So what do you see from here? Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira holds Yesh Zika, because he says you can't consummate with the sister. And Va'omar Shmuel halacha ka Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. And Shmuel says that's the halacha, like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. So you see that Shmuel also holds Yesh Zika. So ergo, when Rabbi Yehuda holds Yesh Zika, he's quoting his Rabbi Shmuel. Amar le di'ida Rav Mai. So Rav Yosef says to Abaya, you think that's such a chachma? What's the big deal if we were to say that Rav Yehuda is quoting his Rebbe Rav? Maybe Rav holds also Yesh Zika. And so what are you going to say? No, Kasha de Rava de Rav. But Rav Huna, who said Ein Zika, who was he quoting? He was quoting his Rebbe Rav also. So maybe you'll tell me, but wait a minute. If Rav Yehuda is quoting Rav who says Yesh Zika, then how can Rav Huna quote the same Rav who holds Ein Zika? Maybe that's your problem. He says Dilma Maroi Nihu Nanu Valiba de Rav. So what's the big deal? We find many times that students argue about what their Rebbe said. So maybe Rav Huna holds that Rav said Ein Zika, and Rav Yehuda says that Rav holds Yesh Zika. So how do you know that Rav Yehuda is necessarily quoting Shmuel? The Gemara, so Abaya answers, Kevin de Itmar Mishmei de Shmuel behedja, Mishmei de Rav Ka'amoroi, Lo Shavkinan Mishmei de Shmuel behedja, Mikminan Ka'amoroi Valiba de Rav. So Abaya said it's very simple. If I know that Shmuel, who's one of Rav Yehuda's Rebbeim, explicitly paskins Yesh Zika, and if Rav Yehuda was going to go according to his other Rebbe Rav, we would have to establish that there's a machlokes among Rav's students as to what he actually said, which is a forced contrivance. So then it makes more sense to say that Rav Yehuda was quoting Shmuel instead of creating a machlokes into what Rav actually said. So it's just logical to assume that Rav Yehuda was quoting his Rebbe Shmuel and not quoting his Rebbe Rav. So Amar Rav Kahana, Amrita Lishmaita Kamei de Rav Zvid. Rav Kahana said, I was repeating this over, this suggestion of Abaya that Rav Yehuda must subscribe to Shmuel, and from Nahar Da, and Amar and Rav Zvid responded, he says, Atun hachi masni sula, anon behedja masninan la. He says, you, meaning that the students of Abaya derive it through logic. But we actually have a tradition that Rav Yehuda explicitly said it in the name of Shmuel. That Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Shomeres Yavam Shemesa Aser Be'ima. That Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that Yesh Zika, and that if therefore the Yevama dies, you're not allowed to marry her mother. So Alma Kasavra Yesh Zika, Va'az the Shmuel Latami, and Shmuel is consistent. Da Amar Shmuel Halacha ka Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, and because in the case of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, it's also clear that that's why Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says that you can't consummate with the sister of the Yevama because of Zika. So you see that Shmuel consistently holds that Yesh Zika. But now the question is Utzrichi. Why did Shmuel have to make both statements? Just make a statement in one place and you'll know that he holds Yesh Zika. Why do you have to say it in both places, Yesh Zika? I'll tell you why. Yesh Zika. Hava amina hanemili bechadav al bitrei lo. Because if Shmuel would have only said just a generic statement of Yesh Zika to tell me that if the Yevama dies, you're not allowed to marry her mother, maybe I would have misconstrued that to mean only when there's one surviving brother do we say Yesh Zika, because she's directly connected to him, and that's why we're so machmir to prohibit the mother even after she dies. But maybe if there's more than one brother, where there's no direct connection to that one brother, maybe Shmuel would agree that there's no Zika, and therefore Kamash Malon. Therefore he has to tell me that in the case of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, even where there are multiple brothers, there's an issue of Zika. V'i ashminan halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira hava mina hanemili mechayma v'la achar misa pakala Zika. And if you would have only told me the psak that he holds like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira in the case of where one brother gives kiddushin to the sister of the Yevama, we tell him to wait. And so you see that he holds of Zika even where there are multiple brothers, so why do you need to tell me any other halacha? The answer is because if I only had that, I would have thought that there's only Zika while the Yevama is still alive. But maybe Shmuel would agree that after the Yevama dies, there's no longer Zika. So therefore, Kamash Malan de Zika bichdi lo pak, and therefore you need him to tell me the other halacha, which is even after the Yevama dies, the Zika does not go away gratuitously, and there's still a connection between him and the deceased Yevama to the point where he's not allowed to marry her mother even after she dies. So that's the conclusion of the sugya. We leave off with the machlokas amoraim as to whether yesh zika or ein zika. Doobie Brothers. Let's go on to the next mission. Sounds like a Doobie Brothers riff. No, it's not.
Guitar, so.
Is that the brother's last name?
Actually, a doobie is something different, Bob. I'll tell you about it later.
Dubious?
It's dubious, yes. Okay. All right. Anyway, we're going to have to cut this out of the... I forgot for a moment.
Can all the brothers do chalitzas? They don't all have to do yibum, or not one of them has to do yibum. All of them can do chalitza in succession, right? And then,
no, wait a minute. When there's one Yevama,
yes,
right, only one brother does any action at all. Only one brother.
Oh, okay.
He either does Yibum or Chalitza. Now, as we pointed, I think we pointed this out the other day, that it's preferable to do Yibum, Okay, until a certain point in history. So therefore, we ask the first brother, the oldest brother, do yibum. If he refuses, we don't tell him, well then do chalitza. We then go to the next brother and we say, do yibum. And then if all the brothers refuse to do yibum, then we give one of the brothers the option to do chalitza. Okay? But we don't, the first course of action is not chalitza, the first course of action, at least originally, is yibum. And if one brother refuses to yibum, we give the next brother-in-law the option to do yibum. Okay?
Because if the first one did chalitza, that finishes the rest.
Once one brother does chalitza, game over. Right? Yeah.
If the last brother's a cut, we wait till he grows up, like the case of Yudah and Tamar, right?
Well, we'll see. We'll talk about cases of cotton. We're still only in the incipient stages of Yevamos. We were only 18 blot into a very complex maseches. So
when does a girl lose her option of and when she's forced into it? Is she always forced into?
No, we learned already that a woman is allowed to say muka shchin huli, that this man is disgusting to me. He's diseased, and therefore we do not force her to do yibum.
Wasn't there one situation where we learned that she is forced? I thought there was something where.
No, what we did learn is that if the man rapes her against her will, but he sexually coerces her, then she is his wife halachically through yibum. That is an act of yibum b'diavad, post facto. But we'd never force a woman to enter into yibum.
So she could get divorced at that after.
Yeah.
If she was discussing, presumably she might be disgusted by it.
Right.
But
Right.
She can't refuse. She already got the marriage b'diavad.
Right. Okay. Let's go on to the next mission. Nice interlude. Thank you, Mark. Shnei achim. Umeis echad mehem. So this Mishnah is a continuation of the previous Mishnah. We're continuing our discussion of Eishes ach shelo haya ba'olamo. Okay? So remember, we had said in the previous Mishnah, we had talked about the following case. Reuven dies, Levi's born, Shimon does Yibum. Then Shimon dies. And he leaves over Reuven's widow and his own widow. Okay, so in that case, both women are exempt from Yibum or Chalitza because the Reuven widow is Eishes ach shelo haya ba'olama. We're going to see now a variation on that case with just one minor detail changed, which makes all the difference in the world. Shnei achim umeis echad mehem. Two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. Reuven dies. V'yibem hasheni es Eishes achiv. Shimon does Yibum. V'achar kach nolad lahen ach. And then Levi's born. So we've just changed the order of one detail of the story. In our previous Mishnah, Levi was born before Shimon did Yibum. In this Mishnah, Levi is born after Shimon does Yibum. Okay? So, Umeis, and then Shimon dies. So, according to the Tanakama, the halacha doesn't change. Harishona yotza mishum eishes achiv shelo haya ba'olamo ve'ashniya mishum tzarasa. Then, both women do not fall for Yibum at all. Reuven's widow is an Eishes ach shelo haya ba'olamo, and Shimon's widow is the tzara of an Eishes ach shelo haya ba'olamo. Fine. Same halacha. Asa b'maimer, but if Shimon only does a maimer, which is a rabbinic marriage to Reuven's widow, hashniya choletzes v'lo misyabemes, so then Shimon's widow would do chalitza and not do yibum, because rabbinically she's a tzaras eishes ach shelo haya ba'olamo, but biblically she's not, and therefore she is subject to yibum to some extent, but you can't do full yibum because rabbinically she's the tzara of an eishes ach shelo haya ba'olamo, and therefore you do chalitza instead.
Right. Once Shimon marries Reuven's wife, the Yevamos, doesn't she fall away from Reuven's connection entirely? And then
according to Reb Shimon, but not according to the Tanakama. Now we're going to see the Shita of Reb Shimon. So you're anticipating the next line of the Mishnah. Reb Shimon Oimer, Reb Shimon disagrees. Reb Shimon says, Mi habem le'ezo mehem sheyirtza, o choletz le'ezo mehen sheyirtza. In a situation which you've just described, where Shimon does Yibum and then Levi is born, I hold that there's no more stigma on Reuven's widow of being an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, because when Levi comes into the world, he doesn't find her as Reuven's widow, he finds her as his living brother Shimon's wife. And therefore, this woman is not an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, and therefore when Shimon dies, he leaves over two perfectly legitimate women for Yibum, and therefore Levi can do Yibum or Chalitza to either one of them. The Gemara now says, Amar Rav Oshia. Now that's the way we learned this whole sugya already, and we understood that Reb Shimon only disagrees in the latter case where Levi is born after Shimon did Yibum. However, Rabbi Oshia disagrees, and Rav Oshia says, Chalokaya Reb Shimon af barishona, that Reb Shimon not only disagrees in the latter case where Levi is born after Shimon does Yibum, but Reb Shimon holds that even when Levi is born before Shimon does Yibum, then it's still not a problem. That if Shimon goes ahead and does Yibum with Reuven's widow and then Shimon dies, Levi can do Yibum with either one of them. Now, what's the problem? It's an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo. As we'll see, according to Rav Oshia, Reb Shimon is so far in his holding of Yesh Zika, of this principle of Zika, that as soon as Reuven's widow falls to Zika, has Zika with Shimon, it's like they're married already, even before Shimon has done anything. And since, therefore, Levi is born at a time where there's Zika now to Shimon, he views it as if Levi came into the world and Reuven's widow no longer has the stigma of being Reuven's widow because there's Zika already to Shimon. And Shimon is the living brother. The Gemara will speak this out momentarily. So now the Gemara says, first Rav Oshia has to prove his point. How do you know this, Rav Oshia? He says, Mimai midikatani mishna yaseira, bavadirei shalaman katanila. Because you have the whole Reisha, the previous mission that we learned yesterday, seems to be totally superfluous. Why did you need to write the first case, which was the case where Levi is born before Shimon does Yibum? He says, if you're telling me that it's for the sake of the Chachamim, Hashta Yibim Basof Nolad Dechi Ashkecha Behetera Ashkecha Asir Rabbanan Nolad V'achar Kach Yibim Mibaya? Question mark. He says, if the Chachamim are machmir to call the relationship between Reuven's widow and Levi and Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, even where Levi was born after Shimon did Yibum to her, so therefore he finds her already as the wife of Shimon, and yet still the Chachamim say that she still carries the stigma of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, then surely that would be the halacha according to the Chachamim if Levi is born before Shimon does Yibum. So you don't need to make that point according to the Chachamim. Elolav l'Reb Shimon itzterich v'tana Reish l'odiacha kocha d'Reb Shimon v'tana Seif l'odiacha kochan d'Rabbanan. And so therefore the only reason why the Reisha was written was to tell you that according to Reb Shimon, who disagrees with the Chachamim, he disagrees with the Chachamim in both cases. Not only does he disagree with the Chachamim that Reuven's widow was not an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo when Levi was born after Shimon did Yibum, but even before. Even if he was born before Shimon does Yibum, she's not an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo. There's no stigma upon her. Uvidinu deniflo Reb Shimon bereisha lanatzeluhu l'Rabbanan ad demesai lemilsayu v'hader poleg alayu. And really, Reb Shimon should have been quoted in the Reisha. We should have heard Reb Shimon in yesterday's Mishnah saying, I disagree, there's no problem of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo. But Reb Shimon was patient. Reb Shimon said, you know what, I know the Chachamim have a lot to say, let them get out case 1, let me let them get out case 2, and then I'll disagree with them in both cases. That's the way Rav Oshia understands Reb Shimon, not like we had understood Reb Shimon previously in the previous parak. So now the Gemara says, now wait a minute, we're stuck now. Because how can you, Reb Shimon, hold that there's never a problem of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo? Don't remember we proved this, that Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachdav teaches me, the Pasuk teaches me, that the brothers have to be alive at the same time in order for there to be a mitzvah of Yibum. So that's the Gemara's question. When would Reb Shimon ever admit that one of the 15 women that doesn't fall for Yibum is Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo? Under what circumstances? So the answer is the Gemara, B'chad Acha Umis V'nolad Lo Ach. So in a more simple case, not where there's Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, but when the Bernstein family only has one child, and his name is Reuven, And Reuven gets married, and then Reuven dies without children. And then Reuven's mother, Mrs. Bernstein, has another son whose name is Shimon. In that case, Rabbi Shimon would agree that that's a case of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, because Reuven's widow has no one else to marry. There's no zika between her and any surviving brother. That's where Rabbi Shimon would agree that that's the case of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo. Or, Inami, betray v'lo yibem v'lo mis. Alternatively, another case of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo is in the following case, where there is more than one brother. There's, let's say, Reuven and Shimon. Reuven dies. Shimon does not do yibum to Reuven's widow, and he's still alive. In that situation, Reb Shimon would agree that Levi has no option of doing yibum because she's still an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo. In other words, the only time that Shimon would say that the stigma of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo goes off is when Shimon actually ends up doing the yibum. But if Shimon doesn't end up doing the yibum, then Levi cannot ever touch this woman because she's an Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo, because I never met my brother Reuven. Like Rashi explains, Asura lazeh shenola la'achar misa liyavama mizikas ach shelo haya ba'olamo. That she's usher because the zika that comes to Levi is because of a deceased brother that he never met. And therefore, since there's no zika between this woman and him through Shimon, it's only through his deceased brother Reuven that he never met. Even Reb Shimon would agree that Levi is not allowed to do yibum with this woman. So now the Gemara says, okay, let's think about this for a second. I can understand why Reb Shimon disagrees with the Tanakama in a case where he's born after Shimon does yibum, because by the time Levi comes into the world, she's already a married woman to his brother Shimon that he knows. But if Levi was born before Shimon did yibum, why would Reb Shimon hold that there's no problem of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo? When Levi comes into the world, she's the widow of Reuven, the widow of a brother that he never met. So why doesn't Reb Shimon hold that that's a problem of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo? The Gemara answers, Kasavar yesh zika, v'zika kikanusa damya. As I had spoken out a moment ago, it's because Reb Shimon holds so strongly of the principle of yesh zika that he says, by virtue of the fact that when Levi was born, there was a strong zika to Shimon, we look at her as if she's already Shimon's wife. And since Shimon is alive when Levi comes into the world, even if Shimon were to go ahead and die, Levi would be able to do yibum with this woman. Okay, because now since there's and if is once Shimon goes ahead and does yibum with her, and then Shimon dies, she was always as if she was Shimon's wife. Okay, and therefore Levi can do yibum.
At what age Levi could do yibum?
We'll see. The Gemara will talk about what's the minimum age to do yibum. That's not germane to our discussion today, but we will get to that topic, whether it's 9 or 13. It's a machlokas. So Maskefla Rav Yosef Hashta Zika Umaimer Misaf Ilela Reb Shimon Ki Kanusa Damya Ilav Ki Kanusa Damya Zika Lechuda Mibaya. So the Gemara says, how can you tell me that Reb Shimon holds of Yesh Zika, this principle, so strongly that he doesn't hold of the problem of Eishes Ach Shelo Haya Ba'olamo in both cases of our Mishnah? I'm going to prove to you that that can't be the case, because in a situation where there's both Zika and a Maimer, Reb Shimon is misupak. He's in doubt, he's dubious as to whether there is a connection or not, whether we look at this woman as if she's married or not. So how can you tell me when there's only Zika without a Maimer that he definitively looks at this woman as she's married to Shimon? Now, how do you know this? So the Gemara says, "Maihi." What's that case that you're referencing? Did not shlosha achin nesuin shalosh nashim nachrios? Because there's a later Mishnah that we're going to see. This is a Mishnah which we'll see on DAF Lamed Aleph, but we've also seen it already on DAF Yud Beis, and it's the following case: 3 brothers are married to 3 women who are not related. Umeis echad mehem, Reuven dies. Va'asa b'sheni maimer. Shimon does a maimer to Reuven's widow, and then Umeis, and then Shimon dies. So now Shimon leaves over his own wife, plus he leaves over the widow of Reuven that he did a mimer with. There's a rabbinic marriage. So Harei Elu Cholzos V'lo Misyabamos. So the halacha is that both women can only receive chalitza, and both women have to receive chalitza. And why is that? So Levi has to give both women chalitza. The reason is because since Reuven's widow is only rabbinically married to Shimon and not biblically married to Shimon, really she's not considered to be a full co-wife of Shimon's other wife. And therefore, since these women are considered to be coming from two separate houses, you have to do actions with both of them. But why only chalitza? Because rabbinically they're coming from the same house. So therefore you can't do as the Gemara will speak out, why both of them have to do chalitza? Shenemar umeis achad mehem yevamo yavo aleha mishe aleha zikas yavam echad velo she aleha zikas shnei yevamim. So the Tanakama says that certainly when it comes to Reuven's widow, she's coming from the force of two households. She's coming from Reuven's household because there was never a biblical yibum between her and Shimon, but she's also coming from Shimon's household because there was a rabbinic marriage between her and Shimon. So we learn from the pasuk that only when a woman is coming from one household can you do yibum. But if she's coming from two separate households, she's coming from Reuven's household and from Shimon's household, you can't do yibum. So therefore you can only do chalitza. So that's when it comes to Reuven's widow. Now Shimon's widow, you have to give chalitza to, because once you're giving chalitza to Reuven's widow, so then you've already removed the zika from Shimon's household. But that's only rabbinically, so therefore you've got to present Shimon's other wife with chalitza as well. Rabbi Shimon Oimer, but Rabbi Shimon disagrees, and he says, Miyabim le'ezahu mehen sheyirtza v'choletz l'shniya. He says, I disagree. I hold, says Rabbi Shimon, that Levi can do yibum with whichever one he chooses, and he can do chalitza to the second woman. Yevumi to Ravaihu lo. You can't do yibum to both. The dilma yesh zika v'habu shtei Yevamos abos mi bayis echad. Because I'm concerned that maybe there's a connection, a zika, between Shimon and Reuven's widow, because Shimon did a mimer plus there's zika. And on the sod, on the possibility that zika is a powerful pseudo marriage, so then it's Yishtei Yevamos Abos Mi Bayis Echad. It would be two Yevamos coming from the same household, and you can't do yibum to both of them. And Yevu Mechad of Ifter Idach Lo, and you also can't say that only do yibum with one of them and the other one gets off scot-free. The Dilma Ein Zika Kikanusa V'Habu Leishtei Yevamos Habos Mishnei Batim. Because in the event that there's no zika, then the fact that it's Reuven's widow, even though she was zakuka to Shimon, but the zika doesn't create a pseudo marriage, and therefore it's two women coming from two separate households, in which case they would both fall to yibum, and therefore alma misafgale. So you see that Reb Shimon is not sure whether there's such a thing as zika. On the side that there is zika, so then this Reuven's widow is considered already pseudo married to Shimon, in which case you should only be able to do yibum with one of them, and the other one should get off scot-free. But on the side that there's no zika, then these two women are coming from two separate households, and you have to do an action to both of them, and therefore you have to give chalitza to both. So he says, therefore, do yibum to one and do chalitza to the other one. But the bottom line is that you see from this whole case that Reb Shimon is unsure whether there's zika or not. So how can you tell me that in the case of Eishes Ach Shalohaya Bolamu he holds definitively Yesh zika? That's the Gemara's question, and we'll leave it here for today. We'll answer the question.